Dragon's Dogma 2 was perhaps my most anticipated game of 2024. Just at the start of the year, I sat down with the first game and its subsequent expansion, Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen, and I actually finished it twice. Now, the first Dragon's Dogma is a very interesting game because it uses some very non-traditional philosophies, such as the general lack of being able to fast travel everywhere, and it doesn't hold your hand at all, letting you explore the world on your own and learn the mechanics of the game through just simply playing the game. However, for as much charm as DD1 had, it was absolutely lacking in certain areas. Areas that I was hoping its successor would improve upon, and in a way, it did. In other ways, it didn't. And so today I want to sit down and look at the things that DD2 did right, what it missed the mark on, what's in store for the future, and so on. You could say that this video is sort of a critique, but that might give the idea that I'll be objectively correct at all times, which I probably won't be even if I try to be, so do take this video for what it is, a long nitpicky video with my own opinions you may or may not agree with. Also, this video is going to be filled with spoilers, especially towards the end, so just have that in mind if you haven't finished the game yet. First of all, I think it only prudent to mention the launch controversy back when DD2 released, the microtransaction debacle. To give some context to the situation, Hideaki Itsuno, the director leading the development of the game, had famously stated in an interview with IGN that travel is boring? That's not true. It's only an issue because your game is boring. All you have to do is make travel fun. Unfortunately, this statement has been used on many occasions to drag on Mr. Itsuno, and while it can be pretty funny to meme on lead figures in the gaming industry from time to time, I think it's important to bring his entire quote into context because his statement was actually longer. That's why you place things in the right direction for players to discover, or come up with enemy appearance methods that create different experiences each time, or force the players into blind situations where they don't know whether it's safe or not 10 meters in front of them. In any case, the first part of the quote had an unfortunate effect on the launch of the game, as when launch day arrived, Capcom elected to add various items to the DLC store, among these items being port crystals, which are items you can place in-game that allowed you to instantly teleport to the location whenever you use fairy stones. Now, yes, you can find all the port crystals you need by just playing the game, but many players found it distasteful of Itsuno to essentially throw shade at other games that uses unrestricted fast traveling, yet still allows for fast travel in his own game, with the addition of adding paid DLC for the sake of convenience. Now, the issue of Itsuno's statement is twofold, because the idea of travel being fun in DD2 isn't necessarily always the case, but we'll get to that in a moment. In any case, as I've now played through the game twice, I'd say that I'm willing to look past the slight oopsie from Capcom and Itsuno. However, I've got a lot to say about Dragon's Dogma 2, both good and bad, so let's get into it, yeah? Firstly, I think the game opens really well. The foreshadowing of your Arisen's true position in the world and your subsequent capture and forced servitude lays the foundation for a pretty interesting plot. You escape and find yourself on the back of a griffin, and soon enough you're trekking cross-country on your way to the capital, Fernworth. And I think the game does a great job of teaching you the basics and then serving the world to you on a silver platter. This means that, just like with the first game, DD2 has very little hand-holding and it trusts the player to find their own way in the world. And you know what? I appreciate when games do this. Just like with Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, and Elden Ring, exploring and finding your way around the world on your own terms gives you a type of feeling that not many games can provide, and I absolutely adore this with DD2. Exploration is also made easier with your pawns, and the fact that there are abilities that allow you to launch your pawn or yourself, like with the catapult launch, is such a cool detail that is just so distinctively unique to Dragon's Dogma. More on that later, by the way. And this brings us to the pawns, our friendly custom-made men and women of servitude. Now, pawns are really the main mechanic that makes Dragon's Dogma stand out as a franchise. Instead of having other players join you, you instead have companions that are sort of meant to replicate a co-op experience. And for the most part, I really enjoy the pawns in Dragon's Dogma 2 because, you see, pawns aren't like regular NPCs. Actually, they are programmed to learn from your behavior. So if you use certain tactics against specific enemy types, your pawn will actually learn and replicate your behavior, both successfully and unsuccessfully. In combat, it's usually the former, and anywhere else, it's always the latter. What I mean by that is I can pretty much count on one hand the times where my pawn has actually been useful in exploring the world. I cannot tell you the amount of times I've specifically wanted them to throw my Arisen to get to higher ground, only for them to stand there gawking and running around in circles. Case in point, the pawn system isn't perfect, and they're usually pretty dumb. That said, they're still useful, especially as I mentioned during combat, where they'll usually prioritize the most useful spell or ability to help you out. One thing that I don't love very much is the frequency of which random pawns will walk up to you and force you into a conversation, all the frickin' time. It became so common on my first playthrough that I got so extremely annoyed that I started murdering pawns left and right for having the gall to look at me. Leave me the f alone. God, you know what? These pawns are actually way too similar to players than I give them credit for. They're really that annoying. Then again, random pawns do actually engage with enemies you're fighting, so they can act like backup from time to time, so they're not all bad. Also, you can throw them like sacks of potatoes, which is also a viable tactic. And while we're on the subject of combat, let's talk about it for a moment, yeah? First of all, this game is all about the combat and the big boss fights. Don't let anybody tell you any different. Sure, there is a story, and there are characters, both of which we'll get to later in the video, but really, aside from the unique pawn system, the combat is most definitely the main draw of this franchise. And as someone who adored DD1's combat, I can wholeheartedly say that I don't think Itsuno and his team could have found a way to make combat better than it is in DD2. Yes, I really think it's that good, specifically when you're fighting the bigger enemies. And even if you're fighting goblins or bandits and other smaller enemies, there's just something that feels right about swinging a massive sword or axe around and clocking some creature right in the noggin and seeing them take off like a baseball. It's just so gratifying that it's managed to keep me hooked for hours and hours, and it's even better when you're facing off against the bosses. I mean, stabbing a big Cyclops through its skull for massive damage is so incredibly satisfying, and it gave me a similar feeling as to something like Dark Souls or Elden Ring when you finally beat that boss after your 10th try. Really, I think Capcom could have done away with the story, the characters, and other fluff and just called this fantasy monster killing game, and it would have still sold like hotcakes. That's just how good, responsive, and satisfying the combat itself is. And the best part is that every class in the game feels very distinct and different from one another. So whenever you start to grow tired of a certain moveset or playstyle, you just hop on over to another vocation. The best part about the combat specifically are obviously the finishers and maester abilities, these being the ultimate skill of any vocation, and you have to actively seek out vocation masters to learn these. Not that it's hard to do, but some of these you have to put more work into than others to get, like the Archer's Heavenly Shot, where you need to have a high enough affinity with the leader of the elves to unlock it. But once you do unlock it, woof, I straight up got addicted to using this in every encounter after unlocking it. It's pretty much the same situation with every other maester ability. They're a really good reward for that class fantasy, and I've seldom felt that type of power-up in other games, at least in terms of raw progression. Oh, and don't get me started on Meteoron, which is by far my favorite magic spell in any game ever.
Do not let down your guard, even for a moment.
Now, as we're still on the topic of fighting things, we really should talk about a pretty big topic among critics of this game, and that's the enemy variety, or lack thereof. And well, I agree for the most part that there is some serious lack of interesting encounter design after you reach a certain point in the game. That being, well, pretty much the whole game. Now don't get me wrong, the big bosses you find on various parts of the map are all very fun to fight, like the Cyclops, Minotaurs, Ogres, Griffins, and Drakes. The thing is, goblins, humans, stone lizards, and harpies are the main enemy forces you'll be eliminating as you trek through Vermund and Batal, and well, it gets pretty tiring pretty quickly. It gets especially bad once you reach Batal, whereupon you'll be assaulted by monsters every 10 feet or so, and at times it feels like you're constantly swamped no matter what you do. And to be perfectly frank with you, this whole area made me think for a moment that Capcom just couldn't find anything super interesting to add to this region, so they just filled it up with filler monsters to make you not think about slogging through another countryside on your way to the next chapter of the main story. Now don't misunderstand, I think Batal is pretty cool. There are definitely some interesting encounters there, but just like with Vermund and the Volcanic Isle, these are very few and far between. Say for example, Medusa, who you can find in a specific cave in the southwest section of Batal, and killing her through decapitation grants you her head, which you can then use to turn enemies to stone. Now that's what I call a cool enemy. It's the same story with the Sphinx, but instead of greeting you with hostility, she challenges you through riddles, which is a really novel idea in of itself. The only thing that I didn't like very much about the riddles though is that one where you have to remember where you found your first Seeker token. Yeah, screw that one. Other than these two and some other encounters during the endgame, the game is unfortunately filled with pretty much the same enemies over and over. And as much as I enjoy stabbing 30 Cyclopses through the head, it does get pretty stale after a while, even if you're just going through the main story and want to get to the end of the game. The strange thing is that DD2 is actually missing several of the previous monsters DD1 had, like the Cockatrice, which, to be fair, was mostly just a reskin of the Griffin. Still, there's also the Vile Eye, the Living Armor, and several others that were introduced in Dark Arisen that simply just didn't make it to DD2. Now, it would be understandable if you wanted to introduce a slew of new monsters to the game, but unfortunately, most of the enemy types are pretty much the exact same as in DD1. And aside from the repetitive nature of fighting the same enemies in the sequel game, another problem is that DD2 has a much bigger map than DD1, which exacerbates the issue where enemies start feeling much more repetitive, as Itsuno and his team now had to fill up an even bigger map with even more of the same encounters, which causes even more friction among players when looking back at his previous statement of building your game around fun encounters to make things interesting. DD2 could simply have done with much more enemy variety because as it is currently, running around fighting the same enemies over and over gets incredibly tiring and frankly, boring after a while. Anyway, back to some of the things that I do like. I really like some of the armors and outfits in the game for, well, pretty obvious reasons. Yeah, I mean, do I really have to explain this to you? Yeah, I didn't think so. Oh, and as if we really need to talk about it that much, the character creation in DD2 is probably the best in terms of raw possibility in the entire gaming industry. Yeah, said it, DD2 has and still probably will have the most advanced character creator for years to come. I mean, did you see the amount of fan creations that were made before the game launched? You can often create almost one-to-one copies of actual people out there, and it's scary how much effort Itsuno and his devs put into only the character creator. I probably spent at least 10 hours alone on only making characters before the game came out. That's how good it is. Alright, let's see. So far into this video, I've praised the pawns, the combat and abilities, some very cultured armor sets, and character creation. So far, the only thing I haven't really touched on are... oh, right. The story and the characters. Okay, so it probably comes off to no surprise that I've got plenty to say about these aspects of the game, as story, narrative, and characters are very important to me. I mean, this is an RPG after all, yes? So starting off, I do enjoy the political intrigue that the game throws you into at the start of the game. You rise to the occasion against the dragon and claim your throne as the leader of Vermund, only for you to get deposed by mysterious forces and then forced into servitude on a faraway island. The game actually spends a good deal of build-up and political plotting and scheming, where you have to do stuff like infiltrate Vernworth Castle and other investigative things to find out the truth behind the plot to depose you. Unfortunately, most of these missions are pretty lackluster mechanically speaking, and infiltrating the castle is no harder than just waltzing right into the ruling chambers, despite being seen by literally 10 guards or so on your way in. Suffice it to say, the AI outside the pawn system is hilariously bad at times. Anyway, there are some characters here that look like they had some real potential, like that of Wilhelmina, who saves you at least a couple of times in the main story and even makes out with you. And she has some pretty well-designed cinematics and everything. And so you'd hope that at least there will be some more story to this character, that perhaps there is some sort of payoff to her arc or something to that effect. Well, no. After helping you out the second time, she pretty much has no role in the story after that. Actually, that's the fate of most of the cast in this game. At some point, every character just becomes irrelevant in one way or another, except for a few characters like Sven the Boy King. Honestly, the best way I can describe the story structure of DD2 is that it's half-baked. The characters are half-baked, and the plot itself is also half-baked, like a pizza with too much dough and too little filling. Now that said, what I really love about Dragon's Dogma is the concept and the dynamic of the Arisen, their pawn and the dragon. Despite its flaws, DD1 still had a really cool twist at the end where it's actually revealed that the Arisen is essentially getting groomed to become the new Seneschal, or god, through the trial of facing Grigori, the dragon. In DD2, it's essentially the same thing, but with an added twist of the actual god, seemingly, that being the Pathfinder, or this ghosty guy who keeps telling you what to do, being the real villain all along. Now the thing is, as much as I liked the past twist in the first game, I was actually hoping for Capcom to do something entirely new with the story, but it just ends up being mostly the same thing, except for one key element. You see, when you beat the final boss of DD1, that being the Seneschal, or the current god of the world, you end up taking their place as the new Seneschal. Then, when you start up your New Game Plus and make it to the end, well, turns out that your previous Arisen that you created is now the god you have to defeat in order to take their place, which was just so mind-bendingly cool. And it set up this idea of a perfect cycle that has no beginning and has no end. Now, what Dragon's Dogma 2 does is that it actually lets you break out of said cycle by defeating the Pathfinder, which essentially frees the world from the Dragon's Dogma. And you know, that's cool and all, but does it lead to any cool new things in New Game Plus? No, it doesn't do anything in terms of what DD1 did. You don't get any special encounter, you don't get to face your previous Arisen, nothing like that at all, meaning that DD2 yet again lost another ingredient that made the first one so charming and special. Again, it's like the ending wasn't thought through entirely, it's yet again half-baked. And this very much extends to New Game Plus, because as I just mentioned, New Game Plus doesn't actually change the ending or do anything new for your new playthrough. Hell, there aren't any higher difficulty levels than normal, and enemies don't get any more challenging than they already are. So if you went through all the effort of finding all the cool weapons and armor in the endgame version of the map, that being the Unmoored World, well, get ready to destroy most enemies with even fewer attacks than before, with a bonus of no extra content or challenge to make another playthrough interesting or rewarding. Again, I hate to return to this word, but there really isn't any other word that perfectly describes this, but New Game Plus is yet another element of Dragon's Dogma 2 that's just honestly half-baked. Obviously, it makes sense for a game such as this to have New Game Plus, but when it doesn't actually bring anything new to the table, then what's the point? And this brings us to what's in store for this franchise as of today. What about DLC? Expansions? Are there even plans for another Dragon's Dogma in the future? Well, that's a very good question. Honestly, I personally think it's a given that this game should at least get one expansion that can improve on the experience as a whole, sort of what Dark Arisen did for the original game. The problem is, Hideaki Itsuno is no longer working at Capcom, as he officially resigned pretty recently to work on a new game with another studio. This doesn't mean that there won't be future content for the game, as Dark Arisen wasn't led by Itsuno back in the glory days. And by looking at Capcom's own statements, Dragon's Dogma 2 sold well over expectations, so much so that they were able to pay out more money to their shareholders according to this IGN article back in April of 2024. Look, at the end of the day, I think the Dragon's Dogma franchise has tremendous potential, and I wish Itsuno and his team had done many things differently, because what we ended up with was a game that ironically took a few steps back from its predecessor, and along the way it feels like Dragon's Dogma 2 is just less special than the first one, despite being mechanically better in so many other ways. Honestly, I adore Dragon's Dogma 2, but I'm also really annoyed by it, and anytime I think back on my first playthrough, I remember how disappointed I felt at times, because while I was really impressed at some parts of the game, other parts made me groan in frustration and boredom. And as someone who was extremely excited for this release, it just bums me out that this game is in this weird gray zone where you like it, but you also want it to be better. And you know it can be better, but we still don't know what Capcom is planning for it and whether they have any plans at all. And so I guess I'm trying to say that I'm a tad worried that this franchise will be put on ice before long. And I really hope it doesn't, because again, Dragon's Dogma has tremendous potential, and I think it's high time Capcom realized that. Perhaps they already have. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, remember to stick around by subscribing and let me know your thoughts as always in the comments below. This has been Mr. Holton, signing out.